Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and in this video I'm going to cover how select fire mechanisms work in firearms. This video is going to showcase a few examples of select fire mechanisms and closed bolt hammer fired actions. I will point out this is by no means the only type of action to have select fire functionality, but as I have already shown how select fire mechanisms work in open bolt firearms, I would refer you to the video on open bolt actions for further information. Closed bolt striker fired actions can also have select fire modes, but unfortunately I'm limited by the examples available to me in the program I use for these demonstrations, and hammer fired actions with select fire mechanisms are by far more common. And the first example we're going to take a look at is the AK-47. And we'll start off by identifying some of the major components that you may be familiar with if you've seen my hammer fired video. So starting off, we have the hammer itself here. We have the trigger with the sear attached. So the sear is in contact with the hammer due to this surface right here. And when we pull the trigger in the semi-automatic mode, that sear is going to pivot down and away from its contact with the hammer, letting it go. So we're seeing a repeat of the same fundamentals we've seen with other hammer-fired actions. But just like with other hammer-fired actions that are semi-automatic, there has to be some mechanism that's going to hold the hammer in place until the bolt comes back into battery. So as the bolt comes back to the rear, we need some mechanism to hold the hammer in place while the bolt is coming forward and keep it held back until the bolt is fully forward into battery. And to do this, we have this hook here that is part of the trigger group. This hook ensures that as long as we have the trigger held in the semi-automatic mode, that we cannot drop the hammer again. Once the bolt comes fully forward and comes into battery, if we are to let out the trigger, eventually, due to its attachment with the trigger, this hook will also pivot away, releasing the hammer, but at the moment that it releases the hammer, the sear is in place to catch it and prevents it from coming forward. Now the trigger is reset, the hammer is held by the sear, so if we were to pull the trigger again, the hammer would fall forward. This is its normal semi-automatic function. And this hook is going to keep that hammer held so that we have that semi-automatic functionality and do not drop the hammer until the bolt is fully forward into battery and the trigger is reset. Now you might be wondering, what is preventing me from letting out the trigger before the bolt is fully in battery? Well, there's another backup mechanism, and this mechanism is part of how the fully automatic function works as well. And it is this lever here. And if we bring the x-ray out a little bit, we can see that this lever is going to cam as the bolt comes forward. Now, what is important about this is without it camming, this lever will block the hammer from being able to come forward. So it's these two mechanisms. This mechanism here prevents the hammer from coming forward until the bolt is fully in battery. Once the bolt is fully in battery, like so, this block is no longer in the way of the hammer. And now we can let out the trigger and let it reset for the sear to drop the hammer again when we pull the trigger again. So how does this differ in the fully automatic mode? Well, obviously we don't want this hook to hold back the hammer until the trigger is reset before we can shoot again. We want the firearm to continue to cycle and fire off more rounds as long as we have the trigger held in. So our selector switch is going to allow us to do that. So if we bring out the x-ray a little bit, we can see the selector switch here, which is this big lever, and it has two functions. It can either put the firearm on fully automatic mode, or it can put it on safe. For now, we're just going to look at it in fully automatic mode. So as we flip this lever into that setting, we're going to push this block in the way of this hook. So we can see here, this is pivoted into contact with the back end of the hook. And if we bring the x-ray back around so we can see, but we're not obstructing the function of the trigger. So if we were to pull the trigger now, we can see that with the trigger held in, this hook is no longer going to pivot with the trigger. It's being held down by the selector switch. So when the hammer comes forward and strikes the firing pin, the bolt is going to push the hammer back, but no longer is this hook going to hold on to it. It is not pivoting up into a position where it can contact it. So now, the only mechanism we have acting upon the hammer is this lever here. So once it cams into this position, blocking the hammer will be held in place. But once the bolt comes forward into battery, the lever is going to cam back out of the way. And once it cams out of the way, the hammer is just going to drop forward again. Now, we don't see that happening here because we are letting out the trigger. But if I were to continue to hold in the trigger, like so, we're going to continue to cycle. So every time that block releases the hammer, the action cycles one more time. And that is more or less how the select fire functionality in the AK-47 works. All we need is this block to come in, prevent the hook from grabbing onto the hammer until the trigger is reset. Without that hook grabbing onto the hammer, we don't need to have the trigger reset for the hammer to be able to drop again. So it will drop every time this lever cams when the bolt goes into battery. So that's how that functions. And just to show what happens when the lever goes into safe mode, let's go ahead and do that. And here we can see that it pivots further in. So the fully automatic mode is in between semi-automatic mode and safe. If we flip the lever fully into the safe position, what happens is the block pivots in and it will block not only the hook, but also the trigger itself. So if we try and pull the trigger will not pivot and the sear will not let go of the hammer. So that is how the selector switch on the AK-47 works. It has the dual functionality of allowing for fully automatic fire as well as putting the firearm into safe. The next couple examples we're going to take a look at are variants of the AR-15 platform. The first of which is the M16A1, which only has semi-automatic and fully automatic firing modes. We're going to start off by taking a look at the semi-automatic mode so we can see how that functions and see how it compares to the functionality of the fully automatic mode. The selector switch is right here, and currently it is in the semi-automatic mode. So as we pull the trigger is going to pivot, and the sear, which is here, is going to break its contact with the hammer here. Once that happens, the hammer is going to fall forward. And as the bolt pushes the hammer back, it's going to contact this hook, very reminiscent of how the AK-47 works. The hook is going to hold the hammer back until the trigger is released, at which point the sear comes back into contact with the hammer, preventing it from falling fully forward. And for the fully automatic mode, the selector switch is going to achieve one of the same functions that the selector switch on the AK-47 did, and that is holding down this hook and preventing it from grabbing onto our hammer. And it does this as it pivots by physically blocking that piece with this part in the middle, comes into contact with that central piece, as we can see there, and prevents it from pivoting upward, being able to grab onto our hook. But the selector switch does another thing. Let's take a look at that again. So in the semi-automatic mode, it is blocking this part here, which is a part we haven't yet considered. There's a reason we haven't considered it, because in the semi-automatic mode, it serves no purpose. But in fully automatic mode, it is very important. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it does. So as we can see there, I'll pause it. This piece is now able to pivot because the selector switch is no longer blocking it. And we can see that it has a spring acting upon it. But currently, it is not moving under that spring tension. And the reason for that is the bolt here is currently keeping it held forward. But once the hammer comes forward and the bolt starts to recoil, it's going to allow this piece to move. And as the hammer comes back, it's going to contact that piece, and then the piece is going to pivot up and fall in the space with this notch. And once the hammer tries to come back up, this piece is going to grab the hammer and prevent it from falling forward until the bolt comes fully into battery. And we'll see that happen as that part of the bolt that kept this piece forward comes into contact with it. It's going to push it forward again, breaking its contact with the hammer, at which point the hammer can then drop forward again. But in this instance, we haven't held the trigger in, so the trigger is going to reset, and the sear is going to stop the hammer from being able to move forward. But if we were to hold the trigger in, we can see that interaction. Every time the bolt comes fully forward, it's going to push forward on that locking piece, allowing the hammer to drop forward again. And it's not until we let the trigger out that the sear will grab a hold of the hammer and prevent it from coming forward or continuing to come forward. So that's more or less how the select fire function works on the M16A1. So with the selector switch set onto semi-automatic mode, I think I have a little bit of an issue because I need to reload. And we'll speed that up. There we go. All right, now with the bolt forward, if we were to switch the selector switch over, we'd block this piece, preventing it from moving. And when we pull the trigger, this piece will no longer move because it's being held by the selector switch. Let's slow that down so you can see it a little bit better. And now it's going to be the hook that acts upon the hammer instead. The last example we're going to take a look at is the M4 carbine, which is going to function similarly to that of the M16A1, but one extra bit of functionality is going to change up its function quite a bit, and that is the addition of a burst fire mode. So just like with the M16A1, we have the trigger here, the sear with its contact with the hammer, and I would say a hook, but in this case, there's actually two hooks, and this is to facilitate the burst fire mode. So with the selector switch in the semi-automatic mode, currently the selector switch is holding in the innermost or rightmost hook, preventing it from moving, but the leftmost or outermost hook, as we're looking from this side, will move during the cycling of the action. So as we pull the trigger, we'll see that outermost hook pivot forward, and it will interact with the hammer just like what we saw with the M16. And it's not until we let the trigger back out and it resets and the sear grabs a hold of the hammer that another trigger pull will allow the hammer to drop forward again. So very similar there. But we do have this extra hook here, and we also have the locking piece like before. Now, the fully automatic mode works pretty much exactly the same as what we've seen before. So let's go ahead and take a look at that first. So if I switch that over to fully automatic mode, we can see that the selector switch is now holding in both hooks, preventing them from pivoting, and the locking piece is free to move. So as we hold in the trigger here, we'll see the same overall functionality that we saw with the M16. So nothing really has changed there. When we select the burst fire mode, what is going to happen is that now, rather than holding in the rightmost or innermost hook and preventing it from moving, we're going to hold down the leftmost or outermost hook and preventing it from moving. So we're not going to have our semi-automatic functionality like we had before. Instead, it's going to be this hook that we can see in the front that is going to move. Now, in my tests of this firearm in the program, I have tried pausing the animation so that I can go through it step by step, but unfortunately, when I do that, for whatever reason, the program glitches out and then it just stops working at all. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow it down as slow as I can, and we're just going to have to keep our eye on what happens. Now, the main difference with this hook is its interaction via a secondary hook with this ratcheting cog here. So we're going to have to pay close attention to this piece and what happens as we hold in the trigger. Now, we're going to fire off 3 shots with each trigger pull. So as I press the trigger, we're going to have shot number 1, shot number 2, and we can see that those shots are happening more or less the way they would if this was in fully auto mode. What you might have noticed there with the last shot, that hook came forward and grabbed the hammer. It didn't do it with any of the other shots, so if we watch that again, we'll note hook's not coming forward, hook's not coming forward, but with the last shot, the hook comes forward. And this occurs because of this cog. And you'll note that the cuts in the cog are actually unevenly distributed. So you have shallow cut, deep cut. So if you pay attention to the hook and how it sinks into those cuts, first shot, we have the shallow cut. Second shot, shallow cut. Third shot, it falls into the deep cut, and then the hook comes in. So more or less what happens is as the hammer comes forward, this spring is going to release its tension, driving the hammer forward. And when it releases that tension, it's going to stop squeezing this inner ring here. And we can see inside that is a spring of its own. So what happens is the cog will freewheel when the spring on the outside of it lets it go. And when it freewheels, it will not travel with the hammer. But as the hammer starts to come back down, this spring is going to squeeze it again, and then the two will move together. So let's watch that interaction, but also as it occurs, watch what the hook does to the cog as well. So pay close attention to the cog and zone out pretty much everything else. So here, as the hammer comes forward and the cog is freewheeling, the hook is literally pulling down on the cog and making it so that it ratchets around to the next notch. So if we watch that one more time, you'll see once the cog starts to freewheel, it's going to try and go with the hammer, but the hook is going to prevent it. This spins the cog around, allowing the hook to continue to go along the cog, ratcheting along until we get into that deep cut. Then the hook's going to come in, grab the hammer. So this is how it does the 3 shots and then stops. So it's pretty complex in the way it functions, and I hope I explained it well enough for you to understand it. And I really do apologize that I can't slowly go through the motions, but that is more or less how it works. It's just a ratcheting action. As the spring here releases its tension, it allows the cog to freewheel, the hook prevents it from moving and more or less pulls it down so that when the hammer comes back and the spring squeezes the cog again, the hammer and the cog will move together. So as the hammer is coming back, it's going to ratchet that cog along to the next cut, and it continues to do so until that hook finally falls into the deep cut, which is going to cause the hook to grab the hammer. In any case, that's going to wrap up my look at the select fire functionality in Firearms. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video and learned something about how this works. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.